If you got a Bible this morning, I hope that you do, go ahead and grab it. And we're going to be in Luke's Gospel, chapter 15, finally in the New Testament after months and months and months in the Old Testament. We went through the book of Esther, and then we navigated through the different ladies in the lineage of Christ from the Old Testament during our Advent season. But now we land in the New Testament. A couple weeks ago now, Vince, who is one of our pastoral accountability members, had some friends over to his house during the Christmas season for dinner and Christmas trivia. Now look, I don't pretend, nor do I believe that I am good at a lot of things. I know you might have heard contrary from someone, but I do not believe that I'm good at a lot of things. But one of the few things I think I am relatively good at is Christmas trivia, okay? I'm a Christmas fanatic. Like, I love everything Christmas, and for those who are mourning that Christmas is over, it's never over. Aslan has come. So Christmas is always, okay? Like the curse of the white witch is broken, so it's always. But I'm a Christmas fanatic. I grew up hooked on Christmas, and I'll just let you guys in on a secret, okay? And I think I'm safe for about a year before this is tested, but I've never lost Christmas trivia, okay? So if people are asking you about your pastor, you can just tell them that. He's never lost Christmas trivia, okay? But I've never lost Christmas trivia, and so Vince has us over. We're doing Christmas trivia. And one of the reasons I've never lost Christmas trivia is, yes, I love the songs of Christmas, and I love a lot of the movies of Christmas. Some of them I did not grow up on, and so I don't love as much. But there's a certain category of Christmas trivia that I always just slay. And it is the category of Bible Christmas trivia. I just can't wait till we get to that point every single time. And by God's judgment, Vince decided there would be no Bible Christmas trivia at this night. And so there's 5 rounds. I've got my team. I'm the captain of my team. And after round 2, we're down like 9 points. It's literally like 24-15. It's terrible. We're getting slaughtered. And I'm over there and I'm trying to pretend like it doesn't bother me. I'm just singing tidings of comfort and joy over and over again in my head. And round 3, it didn't get much better. But then round 4, even though no Bible Christmas trivia, round 4, we just turned it around. We were stealing points. We were getting our points. And just so you guys know, still undefeated. After round 5, we were up 3 and we won Christmas trivia. We won Christmas trivia that night. Okay, some people are still bitter about that. It's okay, guys. It's all right. I'm new year, new you. Maybe you'll get me this Christmas, okay? But for now, Christmas trivia. But what I did learn that night, in all seriousness, especially in those first 3 rounds, is there's a lot of stuff about Christmas that I assumed that I knew that I just didn't know. A lot of stuff about songs or movies or traditions or festivities or decoration or whatever it is that I thought I knew and I did not know. And it's just one example of countless examples in our lives where we think we have a good grasp on something, and then truth, revelation, information comes along and it disrupts our norm, and we begin to learn again. Mark Twain, the famous novelist, was once approached and asked, who was the greatest storyteller of all time? And Twain, not a Christian by any stretch of the imagination, a humanist, said, well, that's easy. The greatest story of all time, the greatest storyteller of all time was Jesus of Nazareth. To which they followed up and they asked the question, well, if Jesus was the greatest storyteller of all time, what is the greatest story he ever told? And Twain said very quickly, according to the story, oh, that's easy as well. It's the story of the prodigal son. As we approach Luke chapter 15 this morning, the prodigal son, I get it. Some of you have been with me for a long time. You've heard me preach on Luke chapter 15 before, or you've done Bible studies on Luke chapter 15, or you've heard about Luke chapter 15. I'm here to tell you this morning, there's stuff here not because I have it as a secret, but because it is the revelation of God to us, the transformative, divine word. There's stuff here that we're going to walk away having not known that now we know. And hopefully it's more than pure information. Hopefully for us, it descends in transformation upon our souls. So what we're going to do is we're just going to walk through the text this morning together like we typically would. Luke chapter 15, we're going to descend right into the setting. Jesus here is talking. He's talking to a collection of people, a crowd of people. I'll talk more about that crowd and who this crowd represents and who they were in the first century. But Jesus is in the midst of talking about lost sheep and a lost coin and the cost of following Jesus in the previous chapter. And now he gets to chapter 15, verse number 11. And the reason why this sermon will be number one in part one of 6 in our sermon series on foundations of who we are, what we believe, what sets us apart, what makes us different, is because we are a movement, hopefully, we're becoming a movement of people, followers of Christ, who want to be moved, want to be transformed as we understand and experience the radical grace of Jesus Christ. We need to hear it all the time, and we hear it here from the mouth of the greatest storyteller ever. Verse number 11, chapter 15, follow along with me. Jesus also said, a man had 2 sons. The younger of them said to his father, Father, give me a share of the estate I have coming to me. Now we pause here really quick because a couple of things are important. Number one, this would have been a very familiar story in Jesus' day. Like Alistair Begg pointed this out when I was listening to him. I read some commentaries on this. This was not a story that Jesus invents, that he comes up with, that he concocts. This is a legend that he is using, and the story that they've heard, that all these Jewish individuals have heard, goes something like this. There's a rich man, he has 2 sons, an older son, a younger son. And the younger son comes to the father and says, give me my inheritance early. Now, you did not do that in the first century. That would be like me going to my father and saying, I wish you were dead. That's the only way that I would receive that inheritance. You only receive the inheritance upon the death of the father. So incredibly dishonorable, remarkably disrespectful. The younger son goes and says, give me my inheritance, give me my portion of the estate. If there's 2 sons, the older son would receive 2/3 of the estate and the younger son 1/3. So the father has to auction off things, lay off workers, gives the son 1/3 of the estate. The younger son then goes and he moves into a foreign country, abandons the family, forsakes his lineage, and squanders his inheritance. Now, the legend is that the older brother then descends at the behest of the father upon the younger son and drags him back to the father. And when he is dragged back to the father in all of his shame and in all of his disrespect, having squandered the inheritance, that the father, the older brother, and all the inhabitants of the village gather together and they stone the younger son to death. And that's what he deserves. That's the legend. Don't disrespect your family. Or in other words, you better watch out, you better not cry, right? Like this is what's gonna happen to those who are impure and unrighteous and graceless, stoned to death. So when Jesus starts saying this in the text, the ears of his hearers perk up. Oh, we've heard this story, this is a good story. Look at those sinners around us. They need to hear this. They're about to get stoned, okay? Number 2, a second thing that's really important to note here is that there are 2 groups of people gathered around Jesus. I mean, there are multiple people, but there are 2 groups of people. And please mark this. It says, you back up, look at chapter 15, verse 1. All the tax collectors and sinners were approaching him to listen to him. Verse 2, and the Pharisees and scribes were complaining. Not much has changed. The sinners and the tax collectors are coming to listen to him, and the religious people are complaining. So that's the setting. 2 groups of people, and they are illustrated by 2 sons, an older son and a younger son, all right? So Jesus is telling this story. There's a man who has 2 sons. Younger of them said to his father, Father, give me the share of the estate that I have coming to me. So the father, under no obligation to do this whatsoever, it was not customary, distributed the assets to them, to the younger son. Now, many days later, the younger son gathered together all he had and traveled to a distant country. So this would have been shameful. This would have brought a reproach. You didn't leave your family, you didn't leave your hometown. You certainly did not leave your nation in the first century. So they're thinking to themselves, the hearers are thinking to themselves, he's gone to the Philistines, he's gone to the Moabites, he's gone to the Ammonites, he's gone to the Canaanites, he's gone to a foreign country, he's gone to the Egyptians, the Babylonians. That's where he's gone. And he squandered, look what it says, he squandered his estate in foolish living. After he had spent everything, nothing left. A severe famine struck that country and he had nothing. Then he went to work for one of the citizens of that country who sent him into his fields to feed pigs. He longed to eat his fill from the pods the pigs were eating, but no one would give him anything. Now, we can't fully understand what it meant, the disgrace for a Jewish boy to be surrounded by and feeding and caring for hogs. We don't get that. The closest thing we can come to it is if I were a water boy for the Florida Gators. Like, that's the closest we can get, all right? Like, if I'm there, it's like such a shame on my family. It's a reproach upon my name. Like, oh my gosh, I just couldn't possibly do this. I'm a bulldog through and through, right? No, when we think about shame, and we think about disgrace, it's hard to compare what this would be like. But it would be akin to bringing a prostitute home for Christmas dinner to meet the folks. And just the disgrace and the embarrassment and the shame, that's what's kind of descending up on these individuals as Jesus is talking. And you can feel the tension in the room. You can feel the religious people looking down upon the non-religious people, upon the sinners, upon the tax collectors, from the Pharisees and the scribes. Verse 17, when the boy came to his senses, he said, and I love to point this out, sin is nonsensical. Now, sin is fun. It's fun. I hear Christians, especially in the Reform world, who talk about how sin isn't fun. And I'm always like, you're not doing it right. Like, you don't know what you're doing then. If you think that sin is not fun for a second here, like, of course it's fun for a second here. Of course, Adam and Eve enjoyed the apple or the fruit for a second. But it's kind of like skydiving without a parachute. It's fun for about 3 minutes. And then you're like, oh boy, like something's going wrong here. So he comes to his senses. It's nonsensical. It's fun, but it's nonsensical. So he comes to his senses. And he says this, how many of my father's hired workers have more than enough food? And here I am dying of hunger. I'll get up, go to my father, and I'll say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and in your sight. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. All that's true. Except that he was never worthy to be called the son. Because his position, the older brother's position, your position, my position, is never based on performance. It's always based on received position. Like that's where we stand. So he says, it's like he had this mindset, at one point in time I was worthy, but now I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. And so he rehearses this speech in his mind. Make me like one of your hired servants, verse 20. So he got up and went to his father, but while the son was still a long way off, his father saw him. His father was looking for him and was filled with compassion. And he ran and threw his arms around his neck and kissed him. And the son said to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and in your sight. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. He gives his speech and the father doesn't even acknowledge it. The father told his servants, quick, bring out the best robe and put it on him. Bring a ring and put it on his finger. And I want sandals on his feet, and bring the fatted calf and slaughter it, and let's celebrate with a feast. Why? Because this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. So they began to celebrate. Celebration always follows emancipation. Rescue. Verse 25. Now, his older son was in the field. That's the guy who was in the legend supposed to go and seize and bring back and deliver to judgment the younger son. The older son was in the field, and he came near to the house and he heard music and dancing. I've always found that fascinating, almost humorous right there, because it's one thing to hear music, it's another thing to hear dancing. Okay? You hear dancing, there's a party going on. These people are cutting a rug. They're getting down. So he says he hears music and he hears dancing. This is also fascinating. So, verse 26, he summoned the father, his beloved father, right? No. He summoned another Baptist, Methodist, Presbyterian churchgoer. He summoned one of the servants and questioned what these things meant. And the servant responded, hey, your brother's here. And your father has slaughtered the fatted calf because he has him back safe and sound. Verse 28, then he became angry and did not want to go in. He became angry. Henry Nouwen, says this, because we need to pause here and hear this. There's a lot of older brothers running around today, and if we're not careful, we'll distinguish older brothers and everyone else and miss the older brother in us. So Henry Nouwen says this: there are many elder sons and elder daughters who are lost while still at home. So we just pause here and let's just make mention of the reality that the hardest sons and daughters to find are those who never left home, who have been in the church forever. They've been religious. Doctrine was just baked into them. They were in Awana, and while they're polishing their merit badges, their older brothers are older sons. And it is this lostness characterized by judgment and condemnation, anger and resentment, bitterness and jealousy that is so pernicious and so damaging to the human hearts. Often we think about lostness in terms of actions that are quite visible. The lostness of the elder son is much harder to identify. A dark power erupts in him and boils to the surface. Suddenly there becomes glaringly visible a resentful, proud, unkind, selfish person, just as lost as the younger son. And so what do we have here? We look here in the text and we hear these words. So he was angry and did not want to go in. So his father came out and pleaded with him. The older son replied to his father, look, I've been slaving many years for you, and I've never disobeyed your orders. Yet you never gave me a goat. So the fatted calf is the most extravagant of gifts, and the goat is almost meaningless. He says, you haven't even given me a goat while I've been slaving away for you so that I could celebrate my friends. But when this son of yours came who has devoured your assets with prostitutes, you slaughtered the fatted calf for him. And the father replies, verse 31, son, he said to him, you are always with me and everything I have is yours. But we had to celebrate and rejoice because this brother of yours was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. Now, once again, we've heard the story. We think we know the story, but I want to kind of draw out three realities from the story this morning. First of all, it's this desperate plight of all of humanity. We talk about this all the time, but we need to, the playing field needs to be leveled. Two crowds of people. You have your sinners and you have your tax collectors. Now, tax collectors you may have heard of. You know, Zacchaeus was a wee little man, tax collector, and climbed up in the sycamore tree to see Jesus. But, and you might think to yourself, okay, let's say that Glenn is a tax collector and that a foreign oppressor comes into the United States and says, hey, we're going to tax you $20. And so Glenn comes to your house and says, I need $25, and he pockets $5. And that's what they would do, and you'd be right in that estimation. But it was much more heinous than mere thievery. What the tax collectors did is they represented this foreign dictatorship that the Jewish people almost rightfully despised. Imagine with us that a foreign power, imagine Iran or China or whoever, comes in and takes over the United States. And in order to maintain their semblance of peace, they levy upon all of us unbelievable taxation. It's like we're living in California or something. Like we just barely survive, right? Like barely survive. They're leveling this upon us. And on top of this increased taxation, 50, 60, 70% of our income, and our kids are starving, our next door neighbor is doing well because our next door neighbor has decided to partner up with China or Iran and has decided to represent them and represent all of their atrocities. And among their atrocities, it would be the enslaving of our men and the rape of our women and the enslavement of our children and the pillaging of our homes. Like that type of oppression. I mean, if you can put yourself there and imagine what it would be like to see your family go through that and then have your next door neighbor walk over and say, hey, I need some cash. Give me whatever. That's the tax collectors. They're despised. The sinners, that's not just a common designation. A sinner in Jesus' day was anyone who was infirmed, anyone who was diseased, anyone who was disabled, anyone who was despised or outcast. These are sinners. Anyone who had an occupation that was looked upon in society as inappropriate or ill-advised. And so it says here, beginning of chapter 15, that Jesus is surrounded by tax collectors and sinners. Everyone knows these people are scum. And these people are sitting there, hear me say this, these people are sitting there desperately wondering as they start to hear the story, how do we get in? The other group of people are the Pharisees and the scribes. Now, let's just be honest. Show of hands. I know it's kind of weird. We don't do that a whole lot. Who's planning on reading through the Bible this year? Whole Bible. Anybody? Yeah, we got a few. Okay. Good luck with Leviticus. Okay. And Numbers and Deuteronomy. Okay. Good luck getting through it. Like that's usually people like are like, oh, Genesis, cool. Exodus, most of Exodus, cool. And then they get to Leviticus and they're like, what in the world is going on here, God? Why is this here? Pharisees didn't just read it again and again. They memorized it. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, all of the Torah. They memorized it backwards, literally, because it's Hebrew. So they memorized it frontward and backwards. They knew this. It was baked into their souls. Like they were religious. They actually added hundreds of additional laws to the Torah that they would pretend to live according to. So these are the most upstanding. These are the most righteous. These are the goody two-shoes. These are the people that everyone hates, but they think that everyone loves them. That's the Pharisees. And he had the scribes. And the scribes were concerned with one thing, passing on the written revelation, the Torah. And so they would spend their entire days rewriting, editing, rewriting from Genesis and Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. These are the most religious. These are the elite of society. And so these are two worlds colliding. And I would argue here today, you have one world saying, one group of people saying, how do we get in? You have another group of people saying, we know the answer and we've done it. And you have Jesus in the middle going, you can't and you haven't. You can't get in. You can't merit that. And you haven't merited that. So it's just leveling the playing field for everyone. He's saying, look, here's the older brother who the father says to him, son, you're always with me and everything I have is yours. Not because you've slaved, but because you're mine. And you have the younger brother who is a wreck, a train wreck. And everything I have is yours, not because you've disowned yourself, but because you're mine. You see, like the younger son, I think we get this, the younger son, or, just to be clear, the tax collectors and sinners. Everybody here this morning, everyone in any church around America today fits into one group or the other. You either know that you're lost, you know that you can never merit it up, and there's this sense of shame that prevails over our lives from our imperfections, or we are delusional thinking that we have measured up and that we've done it. But all of us are equal there. All of us are flawed. None of us can get in by our own merit. And so the younger son is rebelling. The sinners and the tax collectors, they're rebelling. If you're in that group, you're rebelling by running away from the Father's love. The older group, the religious group, the scribes and the Pharisees, if you're there today, you're just trying all the time, you're fighting all the time, you're trying all the time to merit his love. You're rebelling. He was rebelling by trying to earn the Father's love. They're both equal. They're both a mess. So there's this desperate plight that's going on here. That's the first thing we see. The second thing we see is there is a compassionate, ultra remarkable, compassionate pursuit of the Father in the text. What does it say? His son comes to his senses. I'm not worthy to be called your son. I'll go back. So a long ways off, the father sees him. And it says a few things here. Number one, when he saw him, he was moved with splagna. That's the Greek word. Okay? There's no English derivative of splagna. I just like to say it because it sounds cool. Also, it's one of those few Greek words that actually means what it sounds like. It means from the guts. Okay? So, last Christmas, and this happened at various points, so I was reminded of it this week. Last Christmas, Spurgeon got sick. As my oldest, he's 9. And so he was really sick, and he was throwing up all night, and I had work the next day, so Danielle was tending to him, and she was like, the bathroom was like a war zone, and when I woke up in the morning, she's like, don't go in there, I gotta sanitize everything. It's destruction upon destruction. And so I walked downstairs, and Spurgeon is sitting there at our eat-in breakfast table, and he's just drinking some juice or Pedialyte or whatever it was, and he is looking kind of morose, and he's looking sad, and he's looking disappointed, and he's looking frustrated. And there's this shame etched across his face. And he looks up at me as I walk in the room. And he's like, Daddy, I am so sorry. And I was like, you should be. Like, you wrecked the home. It's disgusting now. It's a disgrace now. No, I didn't do that. Now, maybe for me and my wife, if he had deserved it, we might have reacted with a far less compassion. But in that moment, I saw my son and something moved, something twisted inside of me. If you're a parent, you get it. If you have a little one that you love, you get it. When something happens like that, it wasn't their fault. They couldn't help this, and they feel so guilty and so bad. And I just went over and hugged him. I'm like, bro, it's fine. It's good. Everything's okay. It was not your fault. Don't even worry about this. That is one just weak, fragile, tepid illustration of what it means when the father sees the son that he has not seen for a long time and is moved with spalagna, is moved with compassion. It hurts. That's how much he loves the son. And it hurts so much that he throws his robes over his shoulders. He exposes his legs, his upper thighs, which was shameful. You would never do that as a patriarch in the first century. And he runs to his son. He races to the son who has been with prostitutes and tax collectors and sinners and has squandered the inheritance and has shamed the family name. He runs to him beraggled and pitted out and filthy as he is. And it seems cool, the father throwing his arms around the son. They didn't hug a whole lot in the first century, but when the father throws his arms around, remember the legendary tale. The older son brings back the younger son, drags him before the father and all the villagers gather around, and they stone the son. So when the father, don't miss this, when the father wraps his arms around the son, he's not just giving him a hug, but he's saying to everyone watching, if you're going to stone him, stone me first. Like, I will stand in his place. That's the depth of my compassion. I will shame myself. I will condescend. I will humiliate myself in embarrassment here. I will run to my son. I will throw my arms around him. If you're going to stone him, if you're going to stone her, if you're going to stone these people, stone me first. Like, I see you this morning, and I don't know your sin, but I know you're sinners. I know you're messy, and I know you're jacked up, and you know that I am as well. And I've often contended, and Evan says it's like my favorite quote, probably because it's indicative of him as well. Favorite quote that I make. But if you could see the depths of my heart, you'd all go running from this place. I don't care how grace-based you are, because you're not God. God sees all of it and more. He knows us inside. He knows you better than you know yourself. You're like, oh man, I hope he doesn't know that. He knows it and beyond. And he throws his robes over his shoulders and condescends and races to you and throws his arms of grace around you who come back to him pitted out and broken and diseased and suffering, but penitence. He throws arms of grace around you, and he begins to kiss extravagantly the son. Undeserved, scandalous. This is the compassion of the Father. So what we need to do is we need to understand this morning, we need to identify, hey, who am I? Because as Aaron's talking, I'm like, man, I get it. Like, I'm the younger son. I'm that first crowd. I'm the sinners and the tax collectors. I'm jacked up and I'm broken. I know that about myself. And I've got to stop trying to like merit favor now and earn my way back into God's grace. I've got to receive it. The position of sonship and daughterhood. Please hear me. It says position of sonship and daughterhood for you is never achieved. It's always received. Always received. I've got to receive that. Or you're like, you know what? As much as I hate to admit it, and I know it's hard for us to admit it because we're Christians, but I'm the older brother. Like, I struggle with like trying to like do the right thing all the time so that the Father will love me, and I got to release that, and I've got to do the right thing for his glory because the Father loves me. And then we move to this idea of this compassionate, radical, compassionate pursuit of God for us and how he has come after us and how he has condescended and how he has redeemed us and stood in our place. And this is a picture of the triunity of God. The Father has set his compassion upon us, and the Son has redeemed us, and the Spirit has pursued us. And then that brings us kind of to the final point, if you will, this morning. And it involves the older brother. And it's what I would call the sacrificial kindness of the older brother. And you're like, what? sacrificial kindness of the older brother? Well, not the older brother here. The older brother in the legend goes after his younger brother in judgment and condemnation and drags him home and joins in stoning him. The older brother in the story that Jesus tells is angry because I've slaved for you all these years. I put you in my debt. God, how could you let this happen to me? Look what I've done for you. That's the older brother in the story. But as Jesus is talking here, those who have ears to hear begin to understand. This flawed, jacked up, broken, twisted, narcissistic older brother reminds us, in all of his frailty and all of his sin, of the perfect, untwisted, truer and better older brother who actually will come for the wayward child, for his brothers and sisters. Not ashamed to call them brothers and sisters, Hebrews chapter 2 says, and will bring us back to the Father in reconciliation, in restoration. Last week, I was in Spurgeon's room, and my two youngest children wanted me to swing them around the room. Please, Daddy, swing us around the room. And so I'm like, no, I'm not bad back, I'm old and all this. And they're like, please, Daddy, please. And I'm like, all right, I'll do it. So I start off swinging them by their arms. Eventually we get to their legs, I'm just swinging by their feet. And it's so much glee and so much ecstasy there. And they're squealing, Augustine's squealing and Evie's squealing, but I'm holding them by their elbows, of course, because Dr. Choice told me don't hold them by the wrist. And so I'm holding them by the elbows and I'm kind of swinging them around the room and we're having fun together and they're laughing. And at first, Evie is holding onto my arms, but as we begin to swing, either because of momentum or pure happiness and ecstasy, she lets go. And so I'm still just careening around the room, swinging her, and I don't let go, right? We understand what would happen if I let go. And in her mind, maybe in Augustine's mind, because they're little, because they're children, they're thinking to themselves, I've got to hold on. But even when they don't hold on, they're still held on to. And as I'm thinking about it, and I'm thinking about Luke chapter 15, I'm thinking about us this morning, and as we head into the new year, and we're in such an achievement-oriented society, I'm just reminding myself again and again, my children were not protected because they clung to me. My children were protected because I, as their father, clung to them. Please hear me say this. If you miss everything else this morning, please hear me say this. We're all about radical grace, being moved by the radical grace of Jesus Christ here. Your position as a child of God, loved by God, one that the Father has extravagantly bestowed compassion upon, the Son has redeemed, that position whereby you stand in all of your sin and in all of your brokenness as a younger brother or as an older brother, as a sinner or as a scribe, but now redeemed and brought home, that position is not ever, please hear me say this, is not ever based upon the steadfastness of your trying. It is always based upon the steadfastness of his grip upon us, of us trusting, we trust in him, and he holds us fast. He clings to us. We get it twisted. The Reformers taught rightfully that faith was the means of salvation, but not the method. And what happens, just so I'm clear, what happens in our world, a lot of times, gospel-centered world, is that we elevate faith to the position where we're believing in our faith. How do I know I'm a Christian? Because of my faith. No, it's not my faith that saves. It's my faith in Christ that saves. Christ is the method. Faith is the means. It's the activity, and even that is a gift of God's grace to us. Robert Farrar Capone, the Episcopal priest, said it this way. The first thing I think you have to say is that while you and I may be worried about seeming to give permission for prodigality, Jesus apparently wasn't. What does that mean? So this is what's going to happen. When you look at the older son and you look at the younger son and you see the father go, hey, this position, all that I have, my presence for you is not based upon what you've done. It's not based upon performance. It is based upon my mercy, my grace alone for you. Right away, people's minds start going to, I have to go back to this every week, people's minds start going to, well, if you tell people that nothing they do ultimately matters in forfeiting God's grace and his mercy and their position before him, then they're going to do whatever you want. Jesus didn't seem concerned with that. He just didn't seem concerned with that in the story, with prodigality. He wasn't afraid of giving the prodigal son a kiss instead of a lecture. a party instead of probation. And he proved that by bringing in the older brother at the end of the story and having him raise pretty much the same objections you do. He's angry about the party, the older brother. He complains that his father is lowering standards and ignoring virtue, that music, dancing, and a fatted calf are in effect just so many permissions to break the law. And to all that, Jesus has the father say only one thing: cut that out. We're not playing good boys and bad boys anymore. Your brother was dead and he's alive again. The name of the game from now on is not bookkeeping, it's resurrection. It's life. Capone would go on to say this a little bit later in his treatise on the prodigal son. Listen close. From anybody's point of view, but the fire department's, rescue can be seen as and taken for permission to play with fire. So anybody else might think that, oh man, the fire department's going to jump in and save me. They're going to put out the fire, they're going to rescue me. But it isn't. End of subject. You can make the same point with the illustration of an infallible lifeguard. The knowledge that rescue is guaranteed can and does lead idiots to go out and surf nobody should swim in. But the lifeguard can't let that consideration interfere with his rescuing. In other words, people may take permission from grace, but the rescuer never gives it. So Jesus doesn't say, hey, go do whatever you want. He actually says, go and sin no more. But not to merit my favor and my approval, because you have it. And what does that do for us? Why do we need to understand and experience the radicality of God's grace? Final quote this morning, once again by Robert Farrar Capone. Indeed, grace is the celebration of life, relentlessly hounding all the non-celebrants in this world. And there are a lot of non-celebrants in this world. It is a floating cosmic bash shouting its way through the streets of the universe, flinging the sweetness of its cassations to every window, pounding at every door in a hilarity beyond all liking and happening until the prodigals come out at last and dance and the elder brothers finally take their fingers out of their ears. That's grace. So for the older brothers here this morning, and that's some of us, and we just need to admit it, we need to confess that. It's sin, it's our religiosity, it's our self-righteousness, our pride. We need to take our fingers out of our ears and hear once again that this position of sonship is granted to us by the radical, compassionate grace of Christ and the remarkable kindness of the truer and better older brother. And for the prodigals here who are like, it's always funny when somebody's like, I've sinned so much. I've sinned so much. Not more than Jesus on the cross. Jesus was never a practical sinner. He was perfect. Peter tells us that. But on the cross, Jesus took every sin of all his people. So when Bundy claimed faith or Dahmer claimed faith, if that was sincere and legitimate, Jesus, 2 Corinthians 5:21, became that sin upon the cross. And your junior varsity sin doesn't even compare. This doesn't even compare. Jesus took all that truer and better, older brother for you, for us, so that we can rest here today as we move out of 2023 and into the year. What a year it's been. And Renee walked in this morning naive. I love Renee, and she's smart, but she walks in naive, and she's like, aren't you glad to leave this year? And I'm like, the next year's going to be just like this one. It's going to be just like this one. Because it's broken. And we swing constantly. Like, you're like, oh man, grace, that's amazing. And then you walk out of here, and tomorrow you're self-righteous. And then you're like, oh my gosh, I shouldn't be self-righteous. And you confess, and then you're wayward. And then you're self-righteous, and then you're wayward. And God is stable. And he's compassionate. And he's the truer and better older brother for us, who keeps coming to us in a heart that hurts and brings us back and says, I'm holding on to you. I'm holding on to you. I will not let you go. Let's pray.